1622, Amsterdam. The buttons that broke a guild. How one woman's tunic unraveled in industry a stitch too far. Hey there, friends. Tonight, we're stepping gently into another time. A quieter world of flickering lanterns, worn-out maps, and stories long buried in the dust. This isn't the history from textbooks. It's the kind that lingers in the shadows and murmurs through the cracks of time. So go ahead and dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe let the soft hum of a fan or a night breeze keep you company. And let's drift back together. If these slow, thoughtful journeys help you relax or spark a quiet kind of wonder, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it feels right to you. And in the comments, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are, and where in the world are you listening from? It's always comforting to imagine us all connected in this quiet little corner. Now. Take a slow, deep breath. And let's begin. You find yourself in the year 1622, walking slowly along the damp, cobbled streets of Amsterdam's Jordan district. The scent in the air is thick with boiled linen, tobacco, fish oil, and wet wool, a city alive not with excitement, but with function. Things here don't glisten, they endure. The bells toll not for celebration, but for the hourly rhythms of labor. Amsterdam in the 17th century is not yet golden, but it is meticulous. And among the most meticulously regulated aspects of this city are its guilds, powerful, bureaucratic, and endlessly dull. Until, of course, something breaks. The Button Makers Guild was among the smaller but stricter trades in Amsterdam. It did not hold the political clout of the shipwrights or the painters, but it was important in ways easily forgotten. Buttons, in 1622, were not merely decorative, they were functional, status-driven, and most crucially, expensive. There were buttons for sleeves, for breeches, for tunics, for cloaks. Some were horn, others brass, pewter, bone, or covered in silk, and every last one required approval from the guild. Guild regulations were nearly biblical in detail. A button had to measure precisely. Materials were to be sourced only from approved suppliers. No artisan could work without proper apprenticeship, 7 years minimum, and no woman could manufacture buttons under guild license. None. The Guild of Button Makers was, above all, a men's affair. The tools, the secrets, the ledgers all passed from master to journeyman in an unbroken sanctioned chain. But chains, of course, are only as strong as their quietest link. And that quiet link, in this case, was a woman named Lena Van Reed. Lena's husband, Joris, had been a journeyman button maker before falling ill in the spring of 1621. By midsummer, he could no longer hold a hammer. By autumn, he could barely lift a spoon, but buttons still needed making. Orders still arrived, neatly folded requests from tailors across the city. Joris, perhaps out of desperation, perhaps with trust in her keen hands, began quietly dictating the craft to his wife. At first, she worked only at night. But soon, Lena was producing better buttons than Joris ever had. The trouble began, as trouble often does, with something innocently practical. A tunic. It was a simple commission, a soft blue wool tunic, for the daughter of a wealthy merchant, stitched by a tailor named Hubrecht Minson. Hubrecht, well into his 40s and known for his meticulous needlework and equally meticulous complaints, insisted on buttons that sang. That is, they must give a small clear click when fastened, like the satisfying sound of glass tapping. Wood. Joris could no longer meet such demands. Lena, on the other hand, could. She fashioned them from tightly compressed horn, soaked and turned, then polished with oil and cloth until they gave the faintest musical ring when pressed shut. The buttons were installed, the tunic was delivered. And that, one might think, would be the end. But Amsterdam even then was a city with ears. The merchant's daughter wore the tunic to a New Year's gathering at the Shutterskilde Civic Guard Hall, known more for its portraits than for its fashion sense. Yet someone noticed. A woman noticed. Then a tailor. Then, as if carried by the cold wind itself, word reached the guild. The buttons were unauthorized. Not only unauthorized but unregistered, uninspected, and worst of all, perfect. So perfect that the tailors began requesting more. Some even asked for Reed-style buttons, unaware that Reed himself had not touched a lathe in months. Asterisk, this was not merely a violation. This was a disruption. Asterisk, the guild summoned Joris for inquiry, but it was Lena who arrived. Asterisk, dressed plainly and respectfully. She presented her husband's apology and a small box of finished buttons, offering them for inspection. The masters, 7 men seated behind an unnecessarily long oak table, examined them for flaws. They found none. But that only deepened the problem. A woman had made them. Guild protocol had no space for this. There were no fines written for female craftsmen, no apprenticeship paths, no policies for quiet substitution. Lena's work had placed the guild not in danger, but in uncertainty, which to bureaucrats is a far greater threat. Asterisk, they issued a formal warning and banned the Reeds from further production. The tailors were instructed to return or destroy all illicit fastenings. A new law was drafted and circulated. Only certified journeymen may manufacture buttons. Substitutes, relatives, wives, or women of any association shall be subject to fines and market exclusion. That should have ended the matter, but it did not. The tunic remained. The sound of the buttons was not easily forgotten. And other women, wives, widows, sisters began to whisper. If Lena could do it, quietly, why couldn't they? If the buttons were superior, what harm was there? If a woman could feed her family through craft alone, was that not worth bending rules? Asterisk, by spring, tailors across Amsterdam were commissioning under-the-table buttons. Not all from Lena, though she was considered the first. Others followed. A widow in Haarlemmerstraat. A young mother in the Canal District. The guild launched raids, confiscated stock, even imprisoned 2 tailors for material conspiracy. But the supply chain had already split into the shadows. Asterisk, the guild's authority was waning. Not from any great rebellion, but from quiet, consistent resistance. The kind done by candlelight. By hands rinsed raw from lye and steam. By those who simply could not afford to wait for permission. Asterisk, and still, the buttons clicked. Asterisk. They clicked on sleeves, on cloaks, on prayer gowns, and work tunics. They clicked in parlors, in bakeries, even on the robes of a minor city magistrate's wife. No one could tell which were guild-sanctioned and which were not. Asterisk, that indistinction was the real collapse. Asterisk, by summer of 1623, guild profits had dropped 27%. New apprenticeships slowed, complaints rose. A report was sent to the city council claiming unauthorized production by female citizens threatens the sanctity of regulated craft, but few listened. The war in the East had drawn more attention. Ships needed carpenters, merchants needed bankers, and buttons were still buttons, yet the quiet had changed. The guild survived, but not as it had been. Fewer masters, looser rules. By 1630, they began allowing widows of members to produce on a temporary basis, unofficially at first, then with limited licensure. A loophole, they said. A necessity, others whispered. But many remembered the true beginning, a woman in a dim room, turning horn on a lathe, while her husband dictated steps between coughs. Asterisk, and it all started with a tunic. Just a tunic. Asterisk, but why, you might wonder, did the sound of a button matter so much? Was it pride? Control? Or simply the comfort of hearing something click into place when the world around you no longer did? Threads beneath the law you return to. Amsterdam not as a visitor now, but as a quiet observer standing in a narrow alley where laundry sways above your head like flags of domestic resistance. It's 1623. The Reeds are no longer a mystery, nor is their button scandal merely a whisper in guild halls. It has become something much more unsettling, a precedent. In the months following Lena's quiet defiance, tailors began acting with subtle boldness. A simple request, "Can you make it sound like hers?" became code for defying the guild, not with protest signs or printed pamphlets, but with stitches and threads. The rebellion was silent, but its effects crept through every corner of Amsterdam's textile market. City records, rarely read even by those paid to write them, began to note discrepancies. Button shipments once logged under certified names now came from unknown sources. Merchant wives ordered uncertified closures, and seamstresses quietly learned the forbidden techniques passed along from Lena's pattern, a method that involved precise heating and oiling of horn that gave each button its unique resonance. And the guild? The guild responded with paper. By summer, they had tripled their documentation process. Inspectors were dispatched, notaries were hired too. Observe workshops, and a brief but absurd campaign was launched to promote the sound of legal fastening. Button boxes were stamped with new insignias, bearing wax seals and Latin phrases like fides per ordinum, faith through order. But in homes, where the candles burned late and the laundry hung damp, no one seemed to care. The truth was simple and uncomfortable. Lena's buttons worked better. But the deeper discomfort lay in the structure of the guild itself, how it defined value, who it allowed to participate, and who it quietly excluded. Lena hadn't just disrupted a manufacturing monopoly. She had exposed how narrow, how rigid, the male-defined lanes of economic life truly were. Behind the public face of guild masters and apprentices lay an invisible layer of unpaid labor, most of it female. Wives boiled water for dyeing, daughters washed wool, sisters sorted horn shavings by hand. And while none of these actions were recognized in ledgers, they were essential to production. The guild's authority stood upon shoulders it refused to acknowledge, and now those shoulders were shrugging. Lena, for her part, did not become a hero. There were no paintings commissioned, no declarations made. She returned to work under the same roof, the same worn table, the same small oil lamp. But she received visitors, other women, discreet, tired, curious. They came not as revolutionaries, but as mothers, as widows, as apprentices in all but name. They came because the city did not feed those who waited patiently for permission. Some brought their own horn scraps. Others came with cloth swatches or small coins tucked into aprons. Lena didn't charge for teaching, at least not at first. But she taught. She showed them how to shape, to sand, to oil. How to time the heating of horn so that it would click without cracking. And she warned them, never let the sound be too loud. The guild listens. By autumn, the unofficial network stretched across districts. Historians now refer to this time as the stilt handen, the silent hands, a wave of informal apprenticeship and trade, invisible to the city's male regulators, powered entirely by necessity and shared craft. These were not organized gatherings. There was no formal code, but there was shared understanding. No one asked too many questions. No one took too much credit. And the buttons continued to click. Tailors, stuck between quality and legality, walked an uneasy line. Some complied with guild rules. Others began double booking, one set of buttons for inspection, another sewn onto the garment. A few were caught. One, a man named Peter Van Loos, lost his shop entirely. But even he admitted, during questioning, that he couldn't meet customer demands without those buttons. Eventually, the city council was forced to weigh in not on the matter of gender or equity, of course, but on the matter of trade stability. A closed meeting was held in the Raad Huis, Amsterdam City Hall. The guilds argued for harsher punishment, stricter licenses, and a formal ban on any female manufacture of critical goods. But merchants, whose profits had begun to depend on faster turnarounds and better product, pushed back. A compromise was struck. A clause dry and dull as parchment was inserted into city code. In cases where a master tradesman is incapacitated, and his spouse or female relation performs in his stead, a provisional license may be issued under strict supervision. It passed unnoticed by the general public. But for the women watching closely, it was a crack in the wall. Lena was offered such a license. She accepted it without ceremony. But with that paper, for the first time, her name was entered into the city ledger, not as wife, not as dependent, but as a producer, a craftswoman. Legally recognized, though still restricted. Others followed. Quietly, carefully, Yet even with this tiny victory, tensions remained. Male apprentices, many still waiting years for their own certifications, resented the allowance. Some said it devalued the trade. Others feared that if women could enter the market, wages would fall. One journeyman even suggested that female-made buttons should be stamped differently, so as not to confuse them with the true article. It didn't happen, but the proposal sat in minutes of a guild meeting for years. Meanwhile, the buttons kept evolving. Lena and her growing circle began experimenting, mixing horn with resin, polishing with lye soap instead of oil, even reusing bone shavings once discarded as waste. Their designs were leaner, sometimes even decorative. Some claimed they could recognize a Lena button by sound alone, but perhaps the most enduring legacy came not from the buttons themselves, but from the practice they restored, women teaching one another. In the margins of linen bills and die orders, scribbled notes began to appear. Coded instructions, tips, diagrams. These scraps, collected decades later in archives, showed how the knowledge had been preserved, not in official textbooks, but in threadbare pages passed between hands. The Button Makers Guild never fully recovered its power. By the mid-1600s, it had shrunk in both size and scope. Some say it was the changing economy. Others blame wars and imports. But those who look closely at ledgers from 1624 know otherwise. There were simply too many good buttons being made outside the walls. Still, the city never held a festival for this. No holiday was named for the seamstresses. No bell rang when the licenses changed. The sound that marked this quiet revolution was smaller, fainter. The soft, clicking echo of a button sliding into place made by hands that were once forbidden to touch a lathe, and yet, we must wonder, if these women hadn't acted, hadn't learned, hadn't dared, would the rules have ever changed? Would buttons still be stamped in silence? The click that echoed you returned to Amsterdam for the final time in this story, walking a quieter path now. It's the year 1645. The canals seem broader. The rooftops have been rebuilt. The air still smells of fish and linen, but also of change, subtle, creeping change like mold on brick or moss between stones. It does not announce itself. It simply appears and refuses to go. The Button Makers Guild now exists in name only. Its office, once at the corner of Leligracht and Prinsengracht, is boarded over. A notice on the door cites consolidation with related trades. In truth, it collapsed under the weight of its own rigidity. It could not adapt fast enough to a world that had already moved past it. But the buttons remain. The Lena style. Buttons, though never officially named, became standard practice. Horn, polished smooth with the oil lemon cloth technique she had perfected, now fasten coats, hats, and cloaks from Utrecht to Antwerp. Few remember where they came from. Fewer still recall the name of the woman who first crafted them in the dim room of her canal home. But her hands, or hands trained by hers, shaped a quiet corner of the city's economy. Asterisk, you might expect a monument. A plaque. A painting, perhaps, of a woman at her lathe. There is none. Lena Van Reed died in 1640, quietly. Her burial record, found in the sparse city archives, lists her only as Vrouw van Joris, Nopenmaker, wife of Joris, buttonmaker. Even in death, her name stood behind his, and yet her work outlived them both. Her tools were passed to a neighbor. Her methods written down in a stitched folio, which now resides in the Museum of Small Trades in Haarlem. The booklet is handwritten, uneven in script, and bound in cloth. It begins not with a dedication, but with a recipe. To soften horn for turning, soak in warm water with vinegar and rosemary, lest the scent linger unpleasantly. It's the kind of document easily ignored. No flourish, no grandeur. Just instructions, practical, domestic, necessary. Asterisk, but history, like buttons, is often held together by what is unnoticed. Asterisk. The impact of Lena's quiet resistance stretched further than even she imagined. Not just in buttons, but in precedent. Within a generation, the idea of women's auxiliary production became less controversial. By 1652, the city of Leiden allowed widows of textile workers to form temporary collectives. By 1670, a group of needleworkers petitioned for independent licensing and won. The floodgates did not burst open. They creaked. But they creaked in her direction. Asterisk, and what of the guild system? It transformed. Asterisk, where once guilds served as fortresses of tradition. Some slowly evolved into training centers, others into unions, and some disappeared altogether. The idea that only one path, passed from father to son, could protect a craft became harder to justify in a world where demand changed faster than hierarchy. And still through it all, buttons clicked. You hear them now as you pass a merchant, brushing lint from his coat, as a baker fastens the collar of her work smock, as a child fumbles with the cuffs of a Sunday tunic. Tiny sounds, precise, echoing in ways no counsel could predict. Asterisk, the legacy of this story lies not in confrontation, but in subtlety. There were no riots, no slogans, no manifesto read aloud in candlelit taverns. Instead, there was a lathe, a pattern, a whisper of resistance passed from one home to another. A refusal not of rules entirely, but of the idea that hands had to be certified to be skilled. Asterisk, Lena never sought to break a guild. She sought only to survive. And in doing so, she revealed that survival, patient, practiced, persistent, was its own form of rebellion. Asterisk, so tonight, if you hear the soft click of a button before bed, remember, it might be the sound of industry, of skill, of necessity. Or perhaps, the quiet echo of a woman who refused to wait for permission. 1891. Montana, the silence at Birchwood Post. Why the mail was never delivered again, the route that froze over. You are standing on a brittle patch of ground, somewhere east of the Bitterroot Range, in the heart of Montana Territory in the winter of 1891. The wind here doesn't whistle. It rasps. It scrapes across timber and bone and slaps against the canvas siding of weather-worn cabins. It doesn't ask permission, and it never leaves quietly. It is a land that respects only survival. Asterisk, and at the center of that frozen sprawl stood a tiny wooden shack with a crooked roof, a faded flag, and a sign painted in flaking red letters, Birchwood Post. Birchwood was never a town, not officially. It was more of a postal station turned hamlet turned rumor. It appeared in only one official census. No one knows precisely how many people lived there at its peak. Some say 20. Others, maybe 40. But it wasn't the people who made Birchwood notable. It was the mail, and more precisely, the silence that followed when it stopped coming. Asterisk, in 1891, mail routes across Montana were thin, treacherous lines across vast, unkind geography. Birchwood was one of the last stops on what was known as Route 12 West, a path that curled through pine forest, past trapper cabins, over narrow bridges, and finally down a steep, icy slope to the Birchwood Plain. The post was staffed by one man, Elijah Thatcher. Elijah had served in the war between the states, or so he claimed. Nobody checked. He arrived in Montana sometime in the 1870s, carrying nothing but a leather pouch, a set of bone dice, and a pair of reading glasses missing one lens. He wasn't particularly friendly, but he wasn't cruel either. He just wanted to be left alone with his letters and his wood stove. The government paid him $2 a week to receive mail from the westbound riders and sort it into pigeonholes. Once a month, a supply cart brought ink, paper, and dried beans. Elijah kept a strict schedule, boiling coffee at dawn, unlocking the shack at 6 a.m., and ringing a small brass bell if anyone's parcel arrived. Most weeks, the bell never rang, but Birchwood's families came anyway. Not for packages or letters, but for confirmation that someone still remembered them. A niece in Spokane, a cousin in Denver, a pension request still unanswered. For these settlers, the post office was not just a place of communication, it was proof that the world beyond the mountains had not entirely disappeared. And then, one day in early December 1891, it did. The last rider to reach Birchwood was a 17-year-old courier named Samuel Finch. He arrived just before sunset on December 2nd, frost clinging to his eyebrows and boots so frozen they made a clacking noise against the floor. He handed Elijah the leather pouch. Inside were 3 letters and one small parcel addressed to a Reverend Wilkins. Samuel asked for tea, warmed his hands by the stove, and said he'd return with the next post in 5 days. He never came back, nor did the next rider or the one after. Elijah waited. A week passed, then 2. The townsfolk murmured but didn't panic. Routes were known to shut down in deep winter. But by New Year's Day, concern turned into something else, something heavier. Birchwood had been cut off. The snow came hard that January. Drifts rose to waist height. Icicles hung like teeth from porch roofs, and no news came from the east or west. Elijah, ever methodical, wrote in his ledger each morning, "No mail received." He began dating the entries with little question. Marks. By February, the ink had run out, and he was scribbling in charcoal. Some tried to hike out. A trapper named Henley made it 5 miles before turning back with frostbite. A local woman, Mrs. Ackley, swore she saw a rider in the woods one dawn, but no tracks were found. And still, the mail did not arrive. Some blamed the weather. Others blamed the route manager in Billings. But a few began to suspect Elijah himself. Rumors spread quickly in towns with nothing to do. Maybe he was burning letters. Maybe he had gone mad. Maybe he'd hidden the real mail under the floorboards. Children whispered that he kept the missing parcels in a locked trunk he never opened. One boy claimed to have heard voices coming from inside the post shack after dark, low and urgent. None of it was ever proven, and Elijah never explained. He simply continued his schedule. Opened the door at 6. Rang the bell if there was anything to ring for which there wasn't. He even stood outside during blizzards for exactly 10 minutes, just in case a rider crested the hill. And then he went back inside and added another entry to his charcoal-stained ledger. No mail, cold, wind stronger today. By late February, the town had begun to unravel. The Ackley child came down with fever. A family vanished into the woods, presumably headed for the rail station. And then, in early March, Elijah closed the shack, locked the door, left the bell on the hook. He nailed a sign to the front that read, "Mail indefinitely suspended. No word from east. No answer from west. God keep you." No one saw him again. The Next mail to reach Birchwood came not by rider but by rail in the summer of 1893. 2 years later, when a government surveyor passed through looking to redraw county lines, he found the post shack abandoned. Dust thick on every surface, a stove long gone cold, and a bundle of letters, unopened, addressed to towns that no longer existed. Some still bore Elijah's charcoal notes. Others had no markings at all. The government made no official statement. Route 12 West was permanently closed. A new line bypassed Birchwood entirely, and the settlement was quietly erased from maps over the next decade. No mail was ever delivered there again. Asterisk, but why did it stop? Was it only the snow, or something else? Elijah's ledger, the story of Elijah Thatcher, might have faded into nothing. A name scratched onto a rusted mailbox, a footnote in a forgotten postal registry, if it weren't for the ledger. It wasn't discovered right away. Not when the surveyor came in 1893, not even when the railroad men stumbled through a few months later. It was found in 1906, tucked beneath a loose floorboard, wrapped in oilcloth, and wedged alongside a bone-handled pen. Asterisk, the discovery was made by a young librarian named June Calder, sent from Missoula to inventory abandoned postal outposts. She wasn't interested in legends or ghost towns. She was looking for stamps. Rare ones, misprints, over-inked cancellations, those tiny historical errors that collectors dream about. Asterisk instead. She found the journal. Asterisk, it was brittle and soot-smudged, written in a hand that grew shakier with each entry. The pages weren't detailed, no soaring prose. Just notes, observations, weather, dates, thoughts clipped short, as if Elijah couldn't spare the energy for full sentences. But together, the entries painted a strange, slow portrait of what happened in Birchwood. Asterisk, one of the first entries to raise questions was dated December 5, 1891. Mail arrived. Writer exhausted. Asked to stay. Left at dawn. Package for Wilkins. Curious weight. Feels hollow. That was the last confirmed mail delivery. Then the tone changed. Over the next pages, each entry grew more terse. Some repeated the phrase, no mail, sky clear. Nothing from the ridge. Then later in December, heard hoofbeats, no arrival. Went out, no tracks. And then, in January, voices outside post. No one there, wind not strong. Candle keeps going out. By February, Elijah's handwriting began to slant. The ink had turned to charcoal by then. Slept in post. Stove weak. Heard someone say my name. Checked woods. Empty. Saw tracks near well. The most disturbing entry came near the end of the book. Parcel opened itself. Strings undone. No paper inside. Bell rang at midnight. No one came in. Hit it again. There was no mention of it again. But it became a kind of presence. In the final pages, Elijah stopped logging weather or routine. He simply recorded moments. Didn't light lamp. Watched window instead. Letter on floor this morning. Didn't write it. Something walked on porch. No wind. No prints. Door was open. Didn't unlock it. Can't tell if it's snow or something else now. Then silence. Asterisk. The final page was blank except for a single line written in the margin. Nothing comes, but something is here. That's where the ledger ends. No signature. No final explanation. Just the empty half of a page. Asterisk. What followed after its discovery was a burst of attention Birchwood had never received in its lifetime. June Calder published a short essay called The Postman's Silence in a niche Montana folklore journal. She suggested the entries might have been early signs of isolation, psychosis, a known condition among trappers and settlers who endured long winters in solitude. But others, less inclined toward medical explanations, had their own theories. Asterisk. Some believed Elijah had gone mad. Others claimed Birchwood sat on a magnetic fault that interfered with writer's sense of direction. One local newspaper ran a piece suggesting the parcel for Reverend Wilkins contained a spiritual relic, an object known for disturbances in another church. But the parcel was never found. The shack was searched again in 1921 by amateur historians. Nothing new was discovered, except for a series of small burn marks beneath the floorboards, perfect circles, like coin-sized brands spaced evenly apart. No one could explain them. A folklorist from Idaho named Myron Deeks became obsessed with the case in the 1940s. He tracked down descendants of the Birchwood settlers. Most had scattered across the West, some to Portland, some to Colorado Springs. Few remembered much. But one name kept coming up, Reverend Wilkins. He was never a permanent resident of Birchwood. He came through once a month, preaching from a borrowed stool in front of the post office or a barn, depending on weather. He was soft-spoken, known for quoting scripture without chapter or verse. According to surviving records, Wilkins was the only person in Birchwood who ever received more than one parcel by name. He left abruptly in the spring of 1892, around the same time the post shack was locked. No one ever saw him again. Deeks tracked a relative of Wilkins to a nursing home in Helena. A great-niece, age 91, who remembered nothing of him except one story he told when she was a child. He said a man gave him a box once that whispered when you held it. He said if you opened it, you had to keep it, and if you kept it, you had to stay near it, because it knew when you were gone. She laughed as she said it, calling it one of Uncle Will's weird ghost stories, but Deeks took it seriously. He wrote a 200-page thesis proposing the theory that Birchwood was the site of a cognitive haunting, an object-based phenomenon that targets memory and time perception. It was never published. The shack was removed in 1967 to make way for a firebreak trail. The original bell was sent to a local museum. It still hangs there. Sometimes during evening tours, it rings faintly on its own. The guides blame vibrations. Visitors aren't so sure. But the question remains, what really happened in Birchwood? Why was the mail never delivered again? Was it isolation, superstition? A man slowly unraveling under the weight of weather and silence? Or was it something else, something packed inside a parcel that was never meant to arrive? The letter that was never sent. There is something deeply unsettling about an abandoned post office. Most ghost towns hold the bones of a once busy saloon, a wind-warped schoolhouse, or a church left hollow by time. But a post office, when left to dust, is different. It wasn't built for commerce or salvation. It was built for connection, for the movement of names, news, and longing across space. So when that connection is severed and no one knows why, the silence becomes unbearable. That's what Birchwood became. Not just a place without people, but a place where memory failed to arrive. The story of Elijah Thatcher might have ended in 1906 with the discovery of his ledger. But in 1983, nearly a century after the post office closed, a researcher named Larva Denholm uncovered something curious in the Montana Historical Society's archives. A single unsent letter, labeled Birchwood Undeliverable. Its envelope was addressed in neat, angular handwriting to the Department of Postal Regulation, Helena, Montana Territory, filed 1892, never processed. The letter was dated March 12, 1892, about 10 days after the last known entry in Elijah's ledger. The author? Elijah Thatcher himself. It was the only complete letter he ever wrote that survived. The ink had faded in places, but the contents were legible. It read more like a confession than a report. To whom it may concern, I write not as a complaint, but as a warning. Something has gone wrong at Birchwood. I do not know if it is the mail itself or the route by which it comes, but there is a pattern I cannot ignore. I have kept records. I have followed every rule. But the silence has become louder than any dispatch. There was a parcel, addressed to Reverend Wilkins, no weight, no seal. It opened itself before the bell rang, and I have not been well since. There are things that have never been signed for, and I fear that if they are not returned, they will remain. Please advise. Or send a man better equipped to understand what. I cannot. Respectfully, Elijah Thatcher, Postmaster, Birchwood Station. The letter was never mailed. Why? No one knows. It remained folded inside a blank ledger page, left in the back drawer of a government filing cabinet. But the tone of it, the fear, the restraint echoed all the strange details that had been passed off as loneliness or madness for nearly a century. Asterisk. The parcel for Reverend Wilkins was never found. Some believed it was burned. Others claimed it had been buried beneath the well behind the post shack. In 2002, a small research team from the University of Idaho conducted a ground-penetrating radar survey near the site. They found a cavity approximately 4 feet deep, circular in shape, but nothing was ever excavated. Asterisk. The town itself, or what little remained of it, was reclaimed by snow, then trees. Today, hikers pass within a mile of Birchwood's former site. Without knowing it, a single rusted mailbox still stands near an old birch tree, bent and pitted. Its flag permanently raised. Local legend says the flag raises itself. But what matters most, what has endured, is the question that Birchwood never answered. What happens when something meant to be delivered never reaches its destination? Does it disappear? Wait? Change shape in silence? Asterisk. Postal records still show Birchwood as closed due to route disruption. But those who study the case closely believe the disruption wasn't to a route, it was to a threshold. A line between what can be transported and what can never leave once it arrives. Asterisk. Elijah Thatcher vanished without explanation. No body was found, no burial record. Some say he walked into the woods and never returned. Others think he stayed in the shack until the last embers of the stove went cold. But one final entry in the margins of his charcoal-smudged ledger offers a last clue. If this reaches no one, that is the answer. It was unsigned. But it felt like a verdict. Asterisk. And so, the Birchwood Post remains one of history's quietest puzzles, not because of what happened, but because of what never did. No delivery, no response, no return address. Asterisk. Only silence. And a bell that some say still rings when the wind is just right. Asterisk. 1811. Bengal, the accountant who kept counting. A life devoted to lost numbers, columns without totals. The year is 1811. You are in a hot, slow-moving corner of the British East India Company's vast domain on the eastern banks of the Hooghly River, in a district known for its rice trade and not much else. The wind carries the scent of wet ink, beetle leaf, and damp paper, an aroma familiar to every clerk working under the low ceiling fans of Calcutta's administrative buildings. Inside one of them sits a man hunched over an ink-stained desk, surrounded by towers of parchment and ledgers bound with twine. His name is Harikaren Dota, and he is still counting. Asterisk. To the junior officers and messengers who pass him daily, Harikaren is just another company accountant. Unmarried, quiet, predictable. Always present, even when no one else is. They know he walks to the registry at dawn, eats the same meal of puffed rice and boiled lentils, and spends 10 hours a day hunched over colonial account books writing, checking, rechecking. Asterisk. What they don't know is that Harikaren is no longer assigned to any current ledger. He hasn't been for 5 years. Asterisk. In fact, he's been working entirely of his own volition on reconciling missing numbers from 1793 to 1798, a 5-year period, during which several shipment records and civil accounts were lost in a fire that consumed the original records room. The company deemed it a minor incident. Compensation was issued, new ledgers were started. The past, they said, could be let go, but Harikaren could not. At first, he asked permission to review what few fragments remained. Then, when denied, he quietly began reconstructing the data from indirect records, shipping manifests, tax rolls, merchant receipts, duplicated pages in old clerks' notebooks. Piece by piece, he began rebuilding a version of the vanished ledgers that once detailed everything from salt tariffs to ferry tolls. Why? No one asked. Perhaps because no one really noticed. Harakaran was quiet, invisible in the way only dutiful men can be. He wrote neatly, submitted no complaints, and filed his timesheets without error. When asked what department he worked for, he'd smile faintly and reply, "Fiscal reconciliation." A term vague enough to satisfy anyone not truly listening. In truth, Harakaran's project had consumed his life. He lived alone in a single-room lodging above a dyer's shop, where he kept stacks of folded accounts bundled with string. His walls were bare, save for a hand-drawn calendar that tracked not the current year but the fiscal quarters of 1794. His bed was a roll of burlap. His dinner always the same: rice, pickle, and a copper cup of boiled water cooled on the windowsill. And every night, without fail, he would take out his candle stub, open the day's entries, and write tiny, careful notes in the margins. Shipment from Murshidabad estimated 8 crates. Missing based on discrepancy with port receipt. No 311. Revenue from toll bridge underreported by 3 rupees. Entry cross-checked with clerk's duplicate in B register. Indigo export count exceeds port manifests. Possible clerical duplication. These weren't errors he had made. They were errors made decades ago by men now long dead or returned to England. But Harakaran took their mistakes personally. He didn't blame them. He corrected them, gently, like a gardener pruning a forgotten tree. No one asked him to do this. No one paid him for it. And yet he continued. Some said he was simply peculiar. Others said he had once loved a clerk's daughter who died young, and the ledgers were a way to stay close to the life he never built. A few whispered that he had lost his family in the famine of 1803 and took to numbers, the way others take to prayer. But the truth was quieter. Harakaran once believed that if he could reconstruct the missing years, if he could bring order to what had been lost, he would restore something deeper, not just balance sheets, but continuity. A thread. Proof that nothing, not even mistakes buried by time, needed to remain lost forever. And so he kept counting. One spring, a new junior officer named Edward Lyle was assigned to assist the older clerks in document archiving. Lyle recently arrived from Bath and already overwhelmed by the humidity and bureaucracy, stumbled across Harakaran during his morning rounds. Curious, he stopped and asked what file set the man was working on. Harakaran replied without looking up, "The ghost ledgers." "Sir." Lyle blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The ghost ledgers," Harakaran said again. "The ones that should be here. The ones that aren't." Lyle, amused and faintly disturbed, told the story to his superior later that day. The senior officer chuckled, shook his head, and waved it off. "Let the man be," he said. "That is harmless. He's been fixing ghosts for years." The phrase stuck. Within weeks, other clerks began referring to Harakaran's corner as the ghost desk. Some teased him gently. Others avoided him entirely. He didn't seem to mind. He just kept writing, checking, recording the numbers of an empire that had moved on without him. But one day, something strange happened. Harakaran arrived early as always, lit his lamp, dipped his nib, opened his ledger. But instead of beginning a new entry, he sat still, staring at the page. For nearly an hour, when Lyle passed by and greeted him, Harakaran didn't respond. It wasn't until midday that he moved again, rising slowly, carefully placing his pen down and closing the ledger without completing a single note. He then packed his materials into a satchel, stood, and whispered something no one could quite hear. Later, someone swore it was, "I've balanced it." He left the office and didn't return the next day. Or the next. When a clerk was sent to check on him, they found the room neat, swept and empty. The bed rolled, the ledgers gone. Only a small stack of neatly wrapped parcels remained, each labeled with a year: 1793, 1794, 1795, 1796, 1797, 1798. Inside each parcel was a complete set of reconstructed ledger. Entries written in Harikaran's precise hand. Cross-referenced, indexed, and footnoted. Not a single annotation missing. Asterisk, the company didn't know what to do with them. They weren't official, they weren't legal. And yet they were too perfect to discard. So they were shelved in the back of the records office under a category called speculative recovery, non-governmental. Asterisk, the clerks eventually forgot. But the ledgers remained. Asterisk, to this day, no one knows where Harikaran went. Some say he traveled east to join a monastery. Others believe he perished along the banks of the river, having completed the only task he believed mattered. A few romantics imagine him wandering from village to village, quietly correcting the numbers others left behind. Asterisk, but as with all ledgers, the ending comes with a question. Was Harikaran restoring the past? Or simply trying to make peace with a world that refused to add up? Ledger of the living. The ledgers Harikaran left behind were more than reconstructions. They were acts of devotion to memory, to precision, and to a version of the world where even forgotten things could be restored. When they were shelved and catalogued under speculative recovery, non-governmental, no one expected them to matter. They were oddities, mathematical fiction. At best, a curiosity for future bureaucrats to shake their heads over. Asterisk, but then something peculiar happened. Asterisk, in 1814, 3 years after Harikaran's disappearance, the East India Company commissioned an audit of salt tax revenues across Bengal. A discrepancy emerged, minor at first, a 2-year gap in intake figures from a series of depots along the southern canals. The company couldn't account for nearly 1,000 rupees in uncollected fees, a rounding error perhaps. A missing registry. Common, but troublesome. Asterisk, a junior officer was assigned to investigate. He requested access to backdated archives and, after some confusion, was handed one of the parcels labeled 1794 in careful, neat Bengali, asterisk inside. He found Harikaran's ledger. Asterisk, it was meticulous, cross-referenced with names, dates, carriage weights, depot schedules, even rainfall on days when travel had been delayed. And buried within it, he found the exact figures missing from the salt. Registry calculated and footnoted with notations like, Invoice 39 missing in depot file. Estimated weight, 2.8 mons. Salt tax uncollected, 5 rupees, 7 annas. He brought the finding to his superior, who scoffed until he verified it against a forgotten shipping manifest found in a trunk from the same period. The numbers matched. Asterisk, and suddenly, Harikaran's ledgers weren't fiction anymore. Asterisk, for the next year, company officers began consulting his volumes quietly, first for clerical mysteries, then for deeper audits. Errors in the tea shipping reports, misfiled ferry tolls, duplicate payments to defunct toll houses, all accounted for in Harikaran's scrawled margins. As one supervisor wrote in an internal memo, this gentleman, though unofficial and long departed, appears to have created the most accurate retrospective ledger of the period we possess. Still, no one promoted him. He was already gone. No one paid him. No one could. But within the walls of the records office, a strange reverence began to form. The name Harikaran Dutta appeared in footnotes, audit reviews, and reconciliation. Summaries, always with the same phrase, referenced from Dutta, SRNG series, accuracy pending formal verification. Yet no one formally verified anything. Asterisk, because to do so would mean admitting that a clerk, not a company officer, not a trained auditor, not a certified civil servant, had quietly outmatched their entire bureaucratic infrastructure. Asterisk instead. They let him become a kind of ghost within the records. Asterisk, you might expect his legend to grow. But it didn't. The clerks knew his name, but the world did not. By the 1830s, most of those who had used his ledgers had retired or died. The parcels moved deeper into the archive vaults, known only to a few record keepers with long memories, asterisk. But Harikaran's influence had seeped into other places. Asterisk, a Bengali clerk named Purnananda Sen, stationed in Barakpur in the 1840s, cited Dutta's work as his inspiration for building a localized inventory tracking method. In a letter to his cousin, he wrote, "If a man alone could rebuild 5 lost years from ashen receipts, surely I can keep a proper ink register of grain distribution." Another officer, William Franks, cited Dutta's ledgers when attempting to resolve a tax conflict in the Sundarbans. His personal diary reads, "Why do I trust these numbers? Because the man who wrote them asked nothing in return." And still, Harikaran's own story remained a void. No one found the will. No final statement. But in 1852, long after his disappearance, a child discovered something unusual near the banks of the Hooghly, a box half buried under the roots of a peepal tree. It was sealed in cloth, tied in jute rope, and wrapped in several layers of oiled parchment. Inside were dozens of notes. Not ledger's letters. None had been sent. Each was addressed to someone named Annapurna. Historians believe she was Harikaran's sister, or perhaps his betrothed. The letters, written in careful Bengali, dated between 1799 and 1804, told a quiet, unremarkable story. The daily frustrations of a clerk, the slow erosion of idealism, the feeling of smallness in a system too vast to know your name. Asterisk, one passage stood out. "I spend my days correcting the work of men who have long forgotten it. I think sometimes that I am trying to stitch a torn sari in the dark, one thread at a time. But if I don't, who will? These numbers may be forgotten by others. But I remember, and I remember you too." None of the letters were signed, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Asterisk, the box was sent to the Calcutta Public Records Office, where it remains, catalogued under unverified private correspondence, probable origin, Dutta H. Few read it. But for those who do, it transforms the man behind the ghost ledgers into something more intimate, not just an accountant, but a soul quietly pushing back against loss. Asterisk, so what did Harikaran really seek? Was he trying to rebuild the past? Or was he grieving in numbers what he could not say in words? Perhaps, like many forgotten clerks of empire, he simply wanted the record to be whole, complete, balanced, not for profit, not for recognition, just for the quiet satisfaction of knowing that every rupee, every cartload, every missing receipt had been seen and named. Asterisk, and maybe that's the real purpose of a ledger, asterisk, not to predict the future, but to account for the past, honestly, even when no one asks you to. There's a particular kind of silence in old archives, the kind that settles between the rustle of brittle pages and the faint hum of ceiling fans. In such silence, Harikaran Dutta's story continued long after his disappearance, not through grand monuments or speeches, but through footnotes, tiny lines, half-sentences, acknowledgments written in the language of clerks. Asterisk, by the late 19th century, India's colonial bureaucracy had modernized. Steamships delivered mail. Trains carried goods once moved by ox cart. But buried in the foundations of this machine were fragments of Harikaran's work tucked behind tax rolls, embedded in shipping estimates, silently influencing how colonial accounts balanced. Asterisk, a railway station manager in 1889, trying to audit toll discrepancies on a salt route, cited the Dutta method for reconciling duplicate manifests. A customs officer in Bombay credited Harikaran's notes as the reason he discovered a 40-year-old overpayment error buried in a ledger 4 clerks had already approved. They were not paying homage, they were solving problems. And Harikaran's Fingerprints were still on the answers. Asterisk, it was as if, in choosing to reconstruct the forgotten years, he had left behind a system, a way of seeing what others had missed. Asterisk. Yet for all that Harricuran contributed, few outside record rooms knew his name. Asterisk, there was no statue, no published memoir. Just that same string-tied parcel in the back of a cabinet marked SRNG series. Over time the label faded. Dust collected. A few files went missing. By the time India gained independence in 1947, Harricuran's ledgers were nearly forgotten, except by one person. Asterisk, her name was Radha Sanyal. She was a junior archivist fresh out of college in Calcutta, sent to help transition British archives to the new Indian civil system. In a dim storeroom, she found the data files while cataloging obsolete customs records. She was struck by the handwriting, precise, controlled, elegant. And by the content, asterisk, she spent 3 weeks reading them. She expected figures. She found something more. Asterisk, she found a mind tracing shadows. A man trying to reassemble something the world had told him wasn't worth rebuilding. In her later writings, she would describe the experience this way. It was as if he believed that even what is lost deserved its final column, that uncounted. Things, years, rupees, regrets still belonged somewhere. He was making peace with the past, one digit at a time. Radha saved the files from disposal. She cataloged them properly. She submitted a paper to the Indian Historical Review titled Harricuran and the Ethics of Quiet Record-Keeping. It received modest attention, but she didn't care. For her, preserving Harricuran's work was enough. Asterisk, she wrote in her personal diary, we remember kings, we forget clerks. But the empire, like all empires, ran on the hands of men like him. And that's the thread Harricuran represents, not a rebellion, not a revelation, but a quiet act of maintenance. An insistence that the past, no matter how dull or obscure, matters. That even if no one asks you to account for it, you still can. You still should. Asterisk, there's a story, perhaps apocryphal, that in the early 2000s, during a computer digitization project, a data entry operator flagged a set of ledgers for deletion. They were redundant, she said. Already archived. Elsewhere. But a senior official noticed the name. Dutta. Harricuran. He paused, then told her, "Leave them." That man caught errors no one else ever did. So the files were scanned, preserved. Now they sit in a government server, beneath hundreds of others. Under a tag, no one would ever search /ind_recon/bengal/mis/c_duta/. But they're there, safe, balanced. Asterisk, and perhaps that is the quiet legacy Harricuran left behind. Not the restoration of one fire-damaged ledger, but the idea that order can be reclaimed even after chaos. That memory, no matter how faded, can be gently redrawn line by line, with a steady hand and a stubborn heart. Asterisk, if you ever find yourself in an old building filled with paper and dust, and you hear the scratch of a pen in the back room, don't worry. It might just be the echo of someone finishing a column that no one else remembered to total. Asterisk, and if you see a ledger dated 1796 with a faint pencil mark in the margin, pause for a moment, because someone once stayed up all night, just to make sure it added up.